The sun over Red Mesa didn't just burn, it scorched the world into silence. Heat wavered above the trampled earth, turning every breath into something sharp. Yet in the center of that dust-choked trading ground stood a woman who refused to bend. Ayesha's wrists bore the faint bruises of ropes, her skin dulled by days of hardship, but her eyes, black as cooled obsidian, held the unbroken calm of someone who had survived far worse than men with coin. Barry Pike jerked her forward, barking prices like he was selling worn-out tack. A few men laughed. Others reached for their pouches. Then a voice cut through the heat, steady as a rifle shot. $40. Ayesha turned. The man who spoke Luther Langford was not like the others. Dust on his boots, restraint in his posture, and a quiet storm sealed tight behind his eyes. When Barry shoved her toward him, she lifted her chin and murmured, low and razor sharp, "You paid for this body, but I obey no price." The trading ground fell silent. Before we continue the story, take a moment to comment below and tell me where you're watching from and why Wild West love stories speak to you. Your thoughts help this tale reach the folks who truly feel its heartbeat. Red Mesa Valley stretched beneath the morning glare like a vast wound of red stone and brittle grass. The land breathed heat. Juniper shadows clung to the slopes, thin and sharp, and the distant ridge rose in jagged layers as if carved by a giant hand. The river that once carved the valley now trickled as a narrow silver thread, its voice barely more than a whisper lost in the wind. Everything smelled of dust, sun-baked pine, and old struggle. It was a land that remembered every wound it had ever taken. Ayesha walked beside Luther Langford's horse with the unsteady grace of someone who refused to collapse. Her ankles were rubbed raw from days of marching under Barry Pike's watch. A faint tremor lived in the muscles of her shoulders, but her spine stayed straight. Her hair black, tangled, streaked with trail dust fell around a face carved from endurance high cheekbones, a jaw tightened by instinct, eyes that moved like a hawk scanning for danger. She said little, but every breath she took announced her determination to remain herself, no matter how many times the world had tried to unmake her. More than once she glanced over her shoulder, not at Luther, but at the empty land behind them, measuring distance, memorizing escape routes, weighing whether she could outrun whatever came next. She didn't trust silence. Silence was where memories crept in. Luther Langford rode ahead with a posture that suggested both caution and exhaustion. His ranch lay several miles north, tucked against a cliff face that shielded his cattle from the worst winds. To the valley's scattered settlers, Luther was a decent man, too decent. They often said someone who offered help without being asked, who lent seed and tools, who arrived with a bucket of water or a team of horses whenever trouble touched a neighbor's fence line. But Luther carried himself now like a man who had learned the cost of kindness the hard way. There was a fatigue in the set of his shoulders, an old bruise in the quiet of his gaze. Once, goodwill had been his compass. Then came the betrayal, small at first. Then cutting, a neighbor blaming him for a failed crop despite the help he'd given, a drifter he sheltered who stole his best mare, a family he protected who later accused him to save their own pride. The world had taught Luther too many lessons about how quickly people turned on the man who stood beside them. He wasn't unkind. He had simply grown careful with where he placed his heart. Now, as he guided his horse through a pocket of shade, he looked back at Ayesha, not with possession, not with pity. Something quieter moved behind his eyes, an unsettled awareness. She was hurt, but she did not break. She was frightened, but refused to show it. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had lived through fire and still walked forward. Not much farther, Luther said. The words simple. Offered like a rope, loosely tossed, she could take hold or not. Ayesha did not answer, but her gaze flickered to him briefly. Sharp, measuring. She had no reason to trust him. No reason to trust any man who had exchanged coin for her body's freedom. Yet she sensed something different in him. A restraint she had not seen in the others who had tried to claim her fate. Behind them, Red Mesa Ridge shimmered in the heat, watching like an ancient witness. Ahead lay Luther's ranchwood, earth, and solitude stitched together in a fragile piece neither of them knew they were about to reshape. The path narrowed as they approached the Langford Ranch, the juniper trees leaning in as though listening. Luther slowed his horse, letting Ayesha come abreast of him rather than trail behind. It wasn't courtesy so much as instinct. She carried herself like someone who hated the feeling of eyes on her back. He understood that more than he wished to admit. The cabin came into view, a lone structure pressed against the cliffside, weathered boards grayed by sun and grit. A small corral stood empty, its rails repaired more times than Luther cared to count. The air smelled of old timber, cold ash, and the faint sweetness of sage crushed beneath their boots. Ayesha paused several yards from the porch. Her eyes traveled over every window, every corner, every potential exit. She didn't step into the shade until she knew exactly how to step back out. You can rest inside, Luther said quietly. No one will bother you here. Her gaze snapped to him, sharp as flint. Walls bother me more than men. He nodded once, absorbing the truth in that. He dismounted slowly, letting her see his hands, letting her measure every motion. When he offered the reins, she hesitated, then took them, not because she trusted him, but because she trusted herself more with control of the horse. Inside the cabin, light filtered through narrow gaps between the boards, striping the floor in thin gold bands. There was a stove, a water bucket, a table built from mismatched planks. Nothing luxurious, nothing threatening. Yet Ayesha drifted toward the opposite wall, choosing distance as her shield. Luther set a tin cup on the table. Water's clean. You don't owe me anything for drinking it. Her head tilted slightly. Men who say that usually want something later. He felt the truth of that land hard between them. I'm not those men. A long silence stretched. She didn't drink, but her eyes moved to the cup, then back to him, weighing his words against every bruise life had left on her. A wooden board creaked. Ayesha spun toward the sound, body tightening like a bowstring, just the wind shifting through the rafters. Luther saw the flash of terror before she forced it back behind her eyes. He didn't comment. Pain made people raw enough without someone naming it aloud. Finally, Ayesha spoke, voice lower, roughened by days without choice. What path do you think you bought me onto? I bought you out of a man's hands, he answered. After that, the path's yours. Her eyes narrowed. You believe that? It wasn't a question. She was testing him, measuring whether this man's honesty could bear its own weight. Luther leaned his hip against the table, keeping several steps between them. I don't know what you endured before today, and I won't pretend I can fix it. But you're safe here, for as long as you want to be." Ayasha's breath shifted short, barely noticeable, the kind of breath taken by someone who hasn't heard the word safe in years. Yet she didn't relax. Instead, she stepped closer to the door. "If danger comes, I walk. I won't be trapped again. Then I'll make sure the danger follows me. Not you." The words slipped out before he could temper them. Ayasha's eyes flickered surprise first, then suspicion, then something quieter, more difficult to name. Not trust, but the beginning of a question about him she would eventually want answered. Another silence settled, this one different. Not hostile, thicker, heavier, holding the shape of two lives circling cautiously around the place where their paths intersected. Ayasha rested her palm lightly against the doorframe, the muscles in her arm taut yet steady. "You speak like a man who has lost faith." Luther didn't look away. "I speak like a man learning where to place it again." For the first time since he'd met her, her expression softened, not much. Just enough that the harsh lines around her mouth eased. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, a hollow, ancient sound. Inside, for the first time, they were no longer strangers, just two wounded souls taking the measure of each other, standing in the thin, uncertain quiet where stories begin. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the land was giving them permission to breathe again. Morning light crept across the valley in pale strokes, touching the cabin walls before it reached either of them. Ayasha was always awake before dawn. Luther learned the rhythm of her footsteps light, careful, purposeful. She moved through his home the way one moves through a forest where danger might be sleeping beneath every leaf. She swept the porch, gathered kindling, checked the horses as though she had been tending ranch stock all her life. Luther noticed how she avoided taking more than she needed. She ate sparingly, drank only after he did, and never took a seat unless he stepped aside first. It wasn't deference. It was caution, etched into her bones. One morning, Luther stepped out to find her crouched by the trough, palm resting against the horse's neck. The animal, usually skittish with strangers, stood still beneath her touch. "You handle him better than I ever did," he said. Ayasha didn't turn. Horses understand what men forget. Fear is louder than anger. He studied her carefully. "You afraid of me? I fear what men do when they believe they own something." She finally looked over her shoulder. "But you do not act like a man who wants to hold another's leash." Luther didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't. Some truths weren't built for quick replies. Later that afternoon, while repairing a warped fence rail, the hammer slipped and split the skin across his palm. Blood beaded instantly. Before Luther could fetch a cloth, Ayasha was at his side, eyes alert, movements swift. She reached for his hand and then paused, hovering just above his skin, waiting for permission. He gave a small nod. Her fingers closed gently around his wrist. The warmth of her touch startled him more than the pain. She tore a strip from the hem of her deerskin dress, crushed a few leaves of yucca between her palms, and pressed the mixture into the cut. Her hands were steady, competent. She had done this before. "You shouldn't waste your cloth on me," he murmured. "It is not wasted." Her voice softened. almost imperceptibly. Pain left unkept grows sick. Better to tend it early. Luther watched her work, watched the way her brows lowered in concentration. Someone taught you that. Ayasha didn't look up. My father. He healed with earth. He said every wound knows its way back to the soil. Her thumb brushed a smear of blood from his knuckle. She didn't seem to notice the intimacy of it, but Luther felt it keenly. When she tied the bandage, her fingers lingered a moment too long. Or maybe his hand lingered in hers. It was hard to tell whose hesitation it was. That evening, the air cooled enough for the valley to breathe. They sat outside, Ayasha on the step, Luther leaning against a post. The world glowed copper. A lone coyote called from the ridge. Wind combed through the sage. Ayasha began to hum. The sound rose and fell like a hidden stream, soft but steady, shaped by memories she hadn't yet offered in words. Luther closed his eyes, letting the melody settle into the space between them. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was something older, something that reminded him that silence could hold more than sorrow. When the song faded, she spoke without turning. Your land is tired. He glanced toward the cracked soil. Happens when people take more than they give. She rose, walked toward the small patch of earth near the porch, and knelt, from a pouch at her waist. She took a few pale kernels of corn. She pressed each into the ground with a tenderness Luther hadn't seen in her before. These, she said, are the last seeds my father carried before Barry Pike found us. If they grow, the land remembers how to forgive. Luther stepped closer, not too close, and watched her cover the seeds. He felt something shift in his chest. Quiet, but certain, like a hinge unsticking. You think forgiveness can grow in this place? He asked. Ayasha looked up at him, eyes reflecting the dimming sky. Forgiveness grows anywhere someone is willing to tend it. Their gazes held. The valley exhaled, and for the first time, Luther felt the distance between them narrow into something fragile and new. Not trust, not yet, but the shape of trust forming, like seeds under dry soil waiting for rain. Inside the cabin later that night, Ayasha chose not to sleep by the door. She lay nearer the hearth, where the fire's warmth could reach her. Luther didn't comment, but he noticed, and in the quiet dark, that small shift felt monumental. The next morning, when their hands brushed accidentally as they reached for the same bucket, neither pulled away quite as quickly as before. It was enough. The beginning of something real always is. The storm came without warning. Not a real storm, just the kind Red Mesa called a promise. When clouds gathered but held their rain tight, grumbling across the sky like restless cattle, the air thickened, humming with the threat of something breaking loose. Ayasha stepped outside the cabin with her gathering pouch slung at her hip, intending only to walk to the forest edge where wild thyme and willow bark grew. Luther watched her from the porch, hands resting on the railing. Don't go far. I never do, she answered, though both of them knew distance meant something different to her than to him. To Ayasha, 10 steps could be far enough to lose everything once more. She walked toward the juniper line. Each tree stood crooked, shaped by years of wind, offering narrow belts of shade. The air tasted of iron and coming rain. and the earth carried the faint scent of something waiting to be undone. Ayasha crouched beside a cluster of sage, her fingers brushing the leaves with a gentleness she showed nothing else in the world. That was when she heard it. A hoof step, soft, cautious, familiar, in the worst possible way. Her body froze before her mind caught up. Noise she'd tried to bury surged to the surface, rope tightening around her wrists, men shouting, the hollow thud of her father falling. Her breath thinned. She didn't turn immediately. Turning gave away fear. But she knew. Barry Pike stepped from behind a juniper trunk like a shadow she had never escaped. His grin spread slowly, oily and confident, as if the valley itself had delivered her back into his hands. "Well, look here," he drawled. "Thought I lost my prize for good." Ayasha rose carefully, every muscle coiled. "This land is not yours." Barry chuckled, tapping the butt of the pistol at his hip. "Neither are you. Don't matter who paid for you. A body like yours pulls coin every time." His eyes slid down her figure with the familiarity of a man who had claimed ownership before. "And I reckon the next buyer will keep you longer." Her heart pounded, but it wasn't fear alone, it was fury. Old and sharp, carved from every night she'd survived under his watch. She stepped back, slow, calculating. The trees were too thin for cover, the ground too open for escape. Barry moved closer, smirk widening when she offered no resistance. "Don't bother running. You know I break runners." His hand shot out. Ayasha flinched, but before his fingers met her skin, another hand closed around his wrist, crushing bone and intent in the same brutal grip. Barry's eyes snapped wide as he twisted, stumbling back to face the man behind him, Luther Langford. He looked nothing like the man who rode quietly beside Ayasha each morning. His jaw was set, eyes narrowed to a storm's edge, shoulders squared with the weight of someone who had found a reason to fight again. Luther's voice came out low, controlled, each word a blade. "If you lay a hand on her again, you'll lose the arm you used." Barry tried to yank free, but Luther didn't release him. The strength in that grip came not just from muscle, but from conviction cold. Clean, absolute. Wade Rixley, Barry's rat-thin accomplice, stepped out from the brush a few yards away, his courage evaporating when Luther's gaze snapped his direction. He hesitated, eyes darting in search of dominance and finding none. You don't want trouble." "Langford," Barry stammered, sweat breaking across his brow. "I don't mind it," Luther said, tightening his hold just enough to make bone grind. "But you're going to walk away. Now." Barry's bravado crumbled. He pulled his wrist hard, wincing when Luther let him go abruptly, stumbling back. He spat. "This ain't over." But even his voice lacked conviction. Luther stepped forward. Barry retreated instantly. Wade fled first, scrambling through the brush like a frightened jackrabbit. Barry followed after him, clutching his arm, nearly tripping as he leapt onto his horse. They rode off without looking back, hooves flinging dust into the air like a retreating storm. Silence settled heavy and trembling. Ayasha stood rooted to the spot, her breath coming too fast. Her hand shook not from fear of Barry, but from the sudden release of everything she had held inside for too long. Luther turned to her slowly, not wanting to startle her. His features softened as he approached, all the steel in him melting into concern. "You're safe," he said quietly. "He won't touch you again." Ayasha's throat tightened painfully. "You cannot promise that." "I can," Luther answered, "and I will." He didn't reach for her. He simply stood close enough that she could feel his presence, bridging the fear between them. For several heartbeats. She said nothing. Then, without fully meaning to, her steps carried her forward closer, into the shelter of his shadow. Her fingers rose, hesitating in the air before lightly grazing the bandage she had wrapped around his hand days earlier. That small touch broke something open in her, something that had long been locked behind walls, built for survival. "I'm tired of running," she whispered. Luther's voice softened. "Then stop. Stay. No one here will ever claim you." Ayesha lifted her eyes to his dark meeting storm blue, and the world around them narrowed to the space between one breath and the next. Not love yet, but the beginning of belonging. Above them, the clouds finally broke, letting the first drops of rain fall onto the cracked Red Mesa soil. Rain in Red Mesa never lasted long, but its scent lingered wet dust, cracked earth softening just enough to remember what life felt like. By the time Luther and Ayesha reached the cabin again, the storm had thinned to a mist, drifting like silver threads across the open valley. Ayesha paused just inside the doorway. She no longer stood pressed against the threshold like a trapped animal gauging escape routes. Instead, she let her fingers trail across the rough grain of the doorframe, grounding herself in the texture of something real, something that did not bind or harm. Luther set down his hat, shaking the water from its brim. He watched her quietly, letting the silence stretch, not the tense silence of earlier days, but a gentler one, like the land catching its breath. "You did not owe me protection," Ayesha said finally, still facing the open room. Her voice held none of the sharp resistance she'd carried since their first encounter. "I walk by my own will." "I know." Luther leaned against the table, the wood creaking beneath his palm. "But wanting to protect someone isn't the same as trying to own them." Ayesha turned. "That distinction is rare among men." He didn't argue. He had seen enough of the world to know it was true for a moment. She studied him with a quiet scrutiny that could have been mistaken for distrust, if not for the softness that had begun to warm her eyes. "What did kindness cost you?" Luther Langford. The question struck deeper than she perhaps intended. Luther exhaled slowly, the weight of old injuries shifting inside him. "Too much," he admitted. "I gave help where it wasn't wanted, offered trust where it wasn't earned. Folks don't like to be reminded someone had to save them. They turn mean when shame sits in their belly." Ayesha stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking to the span of a breath. "So you stopped offering?" "Yes." He met her gaze. "Until I saw you." The cabin steadied around them, the air thick with something unsaid. Ayesha looked down, her fingers brushing the woven bracelet at her wrist, a remnant of her father's teachings, of songs sung around fire, of a world torn apart by Pike's hands. "He took more from me than you know," she murmured. "More than I am ready to speak." "You don't have to tell me," Luther replied. "Not until you choose." Ayesha let the quiet settle again. This time, she did not fill it with guarded watchfulness. Instead, she crossed the cabin and knelt beside the small patch of earth just outside the window where she had planted her father's last kernels of corn. The first shoots had broken through the soil, thin and pale, but alive. She touched the sprout lightly. "My father said the earth forgets slowly, but it forgives quickly." if someone tends it with care. Luther moved to the doorway, leaning there as he watched her. And what about a person? Do they forgive the same way Ayasha rose, brushing dirt from her palms? People forget even more slowly, and forgive only when they choose to live again. Her eyes lifted to his, and something fragile yet fierce passed between them. Later, as dusk colored the sky in bands of rose and copper, they sat together on the porch. Ayasha's shoulders no longer curled inward. Luther's posture no longer carried the weight of distrust. The land breathed around them, wind over stone, the faint drip of water from the eaves. A night bird calling from the ridge. Ayasha broke the silence first. When danger comes again, and it will, I do not run this time. You won't face it alone, Luther said. There were no vows spoken, no declarations of affection. Yet the truth of them rested in the quiet space between their hands on the porch rail, close enough that warmth could pass from one to the other if either dared to move closer. Ayasha tilted her head slightly, studying the horizon where the day surrendered to night. This place feels different now. Luther followed her gaze. Maybe it just needed someone willing to stay. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she leaned back slightly, not touching him, but aligning her presence with his, letting the quiet become shared. For the first time, Red Mesa Valley didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning. Dawn came softly to Red Mesa Valley, as if unwilling to break the fragile peace that had settled over the land. The air was cool, touched by the faint sweetness of damp earth. Luther stepped outside with a bucket of water, intending to check the horses, but stopped when he saw Ayasha kneeling beside the small patch of soil near the porch. She did not hear him at first. Her focus was entirely on the young corn shoots pushing through the ground thin, determined, trembling slightly in the morning breeze. Her fingers hovered above them, not touching, simply witnessing. They grew, Luther said quietly. Ayasha looked up, eyes bright, with a depth that went beyond relief. They remembered. Luther crouched beside her. The soil, once cracked and resistant, now cupped the tender green blades like a palm, learning how to hold without hurting. The sight stirred something inside him, something that felt suspiciously like hope. My father, Ayasha murmured, tracing the air above a sprout, believed a seed is a promise, not of what was lost, but of what can return. Luther glanced at her, at the way sunrise touched her features with gold. And what promise is this? Ayasha met his gaze without flinching. That life can grow again, even here. The words held more than their surface meaning. They spoke of pain laid down gently, of trust mending itself thread by delicate thread, of two people daring to imagine a world built not from fear, but from choice. A quiet step sounded behind them. Reverend Thaddeus Holt approached, hat in hand, his expression warm but unobtrusive. He paused on the path, as if waiting to be invited closer. Ayasha stood first. Luther rose beside her. Reverend Holt nodded. When the earth begins to heal, he said softly, so do the people who tend it. Ayasha extended her hand small, calloused, resolute. Luther took it with steady certainty. The valley wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and new beginnings across the ridge. And there, above the tender green shoots, pushing through red soil, their joined shadows stretched long and unbroken, shaping the outline of a home neither had thought they would ever find.